Here's what I want to do. We're going to read the first 9 verses of Genesis 12. Well, you're going to read the first 9 verses of Genesis 12. Then we're going to walk through this because we didn't get all the way through verse 9 last week. So this should be a little bit review and a little bit more detail from last week. So, Talon, starting with you, pull the mic in front of you and read the first 3 verses.
Genesis 12.
Then Allie, read verses 4 and 5. Connor, you read 6 and 7. Oh, sorry, Logan, you read 6 and 7. And then Connor, you read 8 and 9. Morning, Casey.
Reading. Okay, so
You do 1 through 3.
I know, I'm not that stupid. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you."
So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and all of his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan,
Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up camp beside the oak of
Moreh.
At the time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will give you this land to your descendants." And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord, who had appeared to him.
After that, Abram left the south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west of
Ai, it's just pronounced Ai.
Ai to the east. There he built another altar. He dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord. Then Abram continued traveling south by stages toward the
Negev, which is the Hebrew word for south. So that NLT version gets it a little bit redundant. He starts traveling south by going south. The Negev, I'll show you a map later. The Negev is a southern region in Canaan, but it's also the Hebrew word for south. So we started introducing Abram / Abraham, but I'm going to do my best to continue calling him Abram until we get to chapter 15 when his name is changed. So Abram is called by God to leave. Last week we looked at Ur of the Chaldeans, and we looked at the 2 options for where Ur was located, either really far in the north or really further over in the east. And he's either traveling all the way across the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia to get to Canaan, or he's traveling down south to get to Canaan. It doesn't really matter which one it is because the theological point is the same. God is calling him out of the Babel system. Ur of the Chaldeans, regardless of whether or not he's actually in the place that would later be controlled by the empire, Ur of the Chaldeans is still the Babylonians, just an earlier point in their history. And I would argue that the evidence is becoming increasingly better that he's actually coming from the north, not the traditional site. The traditional site was, for like 100 years, it was a guy named Leonard, I can't remember his last name, a British excavator and archaeologist, Sir Leonard, because he was knighted, I forget his name, but he uncovered it, and all the inscriptions call it Ur of the Chaldeans. But again, Babylon didn't control that territory until about the 900 BC area. They were there before, they move away, they come back. And the empire of Babylon that you see in the Old Testament from like Isaiah's time on through Daniel is the empire proper. But before that, they're still around. They're just not located geographically in the same area. So I think it's probably better that they're geographically located in the north during Abram's time, but it's still the same group of people. It's still the same system of Babel that God is calling them out of. It's like they were in Babel, scattered and went up north and eventually made their way back to their ancestral homeland. That can all be accurate theology and accurate information in Genesis without it actually being what's traditionally and uniformly ideated as Ur of the Chaldeans. And so in Genesis 11, he's called to leave there. And then we get in Genesis 12 the actual details of that calling. So these passages are not chronologically shaped. They are topically shaped. He gets the call to leave three major things and receive three major things. Leave your land and I'll give you land. Leave your family and I'll give you descendants. And leave the blessings of your family inheritance and I'll personify you as blessing itself, which will equal a great name, becoming blessings to others, and then ultimately, in blessing others, all nations, all peoples shall be capable of receiving Yahweh's blessing again. So this is all kind of where we ended last week and picking it up there. So you have to come out of Babel in order to receive God's blessing. Babel was essentially a curse. It is a reversal of God's blessing. It is a scattering and dividing and divorcing of the nations. All stuff that we've talked about. But God is still very, very interested in the nations that he's just divorced and just scattered from Babel. So he calls a single man out of it and said, let me turn you into a great nation. Let me turn you into a people. So out of this Babel system, Abram's being called. He has to leave everything behind in order to actually inherit God's blessings. So where we left off last week and what I want to pick up with this week is I want you to tell me, if you can, where are these concepts in the prologue? Land, descendants, blessings, a great name. Where are these in the prologue? And you can just be general. You don't have to tell me the specific verses if you don't want to. But let's start with land. Where does a land idea that God's going to give land to people originally come up?
Genesis 1.
And okay, in Genesis 1. The specific land gets mentioned in Genesis 2, but you're right, the concept is in Genesis 1. But so let's specify in Genesis 2, what is the land? Where is it? What is it called? What? The promised land is what they're going to call Canaan later on. God is making these promises to Abram about the land of Canaan, and that becomes the label for the promised land. But what is the original land gift that God gives humanity? What is it called? You know it, you're just not used to thinking of it in these terms. Eden. Very good, Logan. The idea of descendants and blessings are uniformly there already where? Chapter 1. They're already there where God says, God blessed humanity and he said, be fruitful and multiply. What's going on in Genesis 12 is another recapitulation, another way of re-saying and rewording exactly what God did in creation. God is interested in humanity and in ruling alongside humanity. The great king of creation is wanting to give power away and work with his family members and let his family members rule alongside of him. His family members rebel. We've been through the rebellions. No need to keep covering those over and over again. But the point is, this concept in Genesis 12 and these three big things, and as you parse them out, they're all supposed to be responses to the rebellion. Where does a great name come up? This concept of a great name. Now, the NLT translation said, I'll make you famous. That's not really a good translation of that. So I've given you the more direct translation here. A great name. Who has had a great name in the prologue? A great name. Let's put it in quotations because it's supposed to be a little bit ironic here. What? Okay, so there's two specific places that you could mention from the prologue. Two different rebellions that specifically mention men of the name, or which is another way that you could translate this in some of those passages.
Is one of the rebellions Babel?
One of them is Babel, yes. So this is directly living in light of Babel. So what was going on in Babel, Logan? What did they want in Babel? When they get to Shinar and they want to build the tower, they're after what?
They wanted the gods to come down and recreate the world before the flood.
Exactly. And to do that, they say, we will be men of the name. That's literally the language there in the Hebrew. And you're exactly right to mention it this way. They want to rebuild the pre-flood world post-flood. To do that, they're trying to get the gods who came down in the pre-flood world, the sons of God, the Elohim that rebel against the Elohim, Yahweh. And those Elohim birthed who?
Nephilim?
The Nephilim. Very good, Connor. And the Nephilim were called men of renown, men of the name in Hebrew. It's a Hebrew idiom, right? It's not an exact English rendering for it. They were called men of the name, the great men, the mighty men in some translations and some ideas. They were powerful, semi-divine half-giants in the thinking of the ancient world. And so they were considered great and powerful men because they conquered and they waged war and they had all this information from the gods. And so they were men of the great name, and they ended up building nothing but corrupt societies. So God hit the cosmic reset button, destroyed their societies, and rebuilt through Noah. And through Noah, you get the blessing language and the descendant language. And of course, he's getting out on the land again. All of that is recreation language. And if you can read Noah's story, and if you can read Eden as these three big ideas, I'll give you land, I'll give you descendants, I'll give you blessing, and then parsing out in detail what some of those blessings are, you realize in the rebellion, they were trying to, all of the rebellions, they're trying to establish all these things on their own. And then what Abram is being called to is say, trust me and I'll give you all of that. Everything that these great men were searching for on their own, without me, if you trust me, I'll make your name great. I'll make you a man of the name, which in part means I'll make you famous, right? Because we're still talking about Abram 4,000 years later, nearly 4,000 years. And so I'd say that's a pretty famous name. It's one of the most recognized, he's one of the most historical, worldwide recognized characters of all time. So he's got a great name, but this is directly reflecting back on the rebellions of Genesis 6 and Genesis 11 in particular. It's using the exact same language so that a good, close reader of the text understands what is going on here. What is going on here is that God is finally dealing with the rebellions. God built the world one way. Over the course of 3 rebellions, we flipped the world upside down. In calling Abram, one way that you can think of it is God is finally starting to set the world right side up again. He's starting to rework with humanity through one man. Let me rework with you, and through our relationship, through our works together, we're going to figure out how we're going to set the world right side up, because it's completely and utterly upside down. And I'm going to do all of this for you. Here's all that I ask. I will be your God, and you will follow me. None of the other gods, because when he's being called out of his land, he's being called out of that Deuteronomy 32 worldview. He's being called out of that system where the gods rule those lands, because Yahweh made it so. But they're corrupt and they lead people astray. And so he's saying, I want you to come out of these lands, and I want you to come to the land that I'll show you. And when he takes off, he doesn't know where he's going yet. That's an important part of Abram's faith. He doesn't really know where he's going in the end. He knows that God has promised him these things, but he doesn't even fully understand what all these promises mean and what they're related to. But we, as readers, having come through the prologue and spent so much time in that prologue, should be able to read through all of this, that when he's talking about all peoples, he's talking about the people of Babel. He's talking about all the nations, all of humanity. God is interested in them. Babel does not mean that Israel that's going to come out of Abraham and Israel alone is supposed to be God's people. God is setting up Israel, a new people, through Abram so that he can ultimately reclaim the nations he divorced at Babel. The humanity that he created in Eden, he wants them back. This is the start of that plan. Everybody got that? See, it's important to understand this, not only just to read Genesis, but to understand that the blessings that you and I have in Christ, just like Abram, are not supposed to be squandered on us. These blessings that each and every one of us have in Christ are supposed to be shared with other people so that they can have access to the same blessings if they want to express the same faith of Abraham, leaving their own Babel systems behind, leaving their own gods behind, clinging to Yahweh. They can be part of the renewed, restored humanity that Christ makes as the ultimate fulfillment of Abraham. And these promises here to bless all people, which is why I'm trying to teach you on Wednesday nights how to actually share the gospel so that you can pass along the blessings that you received, reconnecting with God onto other people so that they too can reconnect with God. But it's all starting here in Genesis 12. So we are part of the ongoing story of Abraham. So it's probably pretty important that we get Abraham's story correct so that we can understand and read our story correctly. All right, so we already talked about this. Blessings, land, and descendants harken back to God's creation, the post-flood recreation of humanity, and his program to partner with us in the world. So Genesis 1:28, God blessed humanity and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the land, which means earth, and subdue it. And then Genesis 1, where he repeats, God blessed Noah and his sons, which means all humanity there. Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the land. And so here at the beginning of Abraham's story, God is being broad and God is being vague. He's not being too detailed, but he makes these promises that he's going to bless and include giving him land, descendants, and blessing, which is the same fundamental things he did with Adam and Eve and all humanity in Eden, the same thing he did with Noah and his sons post-flood. He's doing it again. He's starting over. As his story is unfolding and his blessings multiply across years, Abram's blessings are multiplying across years. God's going to specify certain details about each of these things. What is a blessing? What land? Who are these descendants, right? The specifics of the land are going to come first in verse 7, where the land is going to be identified as the land of Canaan. The descendants are going to be born years later. Their futures are going to become clearer as you read the book of Genesis on how each of these descendants are going to relate to Yahweh or not relate to Yahweh. And blessings and curses are going to continue to be defined and boiled down and expanded upon throughout pretty much the entire Old Testament. And then you turn the page to the New Testament and you start getting even different language for what blessings and cursings are. But for today, just note these connections back to the prologue. Okay? Blessings, land, descendants, and how they hearken back to God's creation and recreation post-flood. So what God is offering Abraham in Genesis 12 and these blessings and the poetic statements in 1 through 3 is an extension of these previous passages. The author wants us to see these threefold ideas connecting the stories of God's work and redemption together as he chases down humanity in our childish little rebellions. And you know what? If you can grasp these three things, you will see land, you will see descendants, and you will see blessings over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Over and over again in the New Testament. The language may change and shift a bit here and there, but it's all fundamentally the same. And it's fundamentally starting back at creation, recreation, and now recreating humanity through Abram. God finally starts to do something about the rebellion. Up till now, he hadn't done anything except let humanity rebel. But he hasn't tried to reverse the curses of Genesis 3. He hasn't tried to change curses to blessings. With Abram's call, he's beginning the process of rebellion and restoration. He will remove sin, evil, and rebellion from the world through Abram. So, what he's trying to telecast, this author of Genesis, to us readers is that just like he started with Adam, and just like he restarted with Noah, Once again, God is starting over with Abraham. So the new humanity of God will now be through Abram and his seed. And this is what Genesis is tracking on. What is the seed? Where did that come from? Where was it originally pointed out to us? Not quite. Not quite. The seed language comes a little bit later. So it's a promise of God. One day your seed is going to come, and this seed is going to crush the head of who? Who needs their head crushed?
The snake.
The serpent, right? The serpent in Genesis 3. The seed is the one who's going to come and crush the head of the serpent. That language there is, what do you do when you have a snake around? What do you want to do to kill a snake? Crush its head. Well, you could shoot its head off, sure, but the idea is that they didn't have guns in biblical times, right? So if you wanted to kill a snake and keep it from striking your heel, which is also the language of Genesis 3:15, where this language is introduced, you crush its head. So this language of the seed, look again at this text. Look at verse 7. Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, to your, what does the NLT say there? To your what?
Verse 7 says, Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants.
Descendants. Okay, so the NLT used the word descendants there. That's fine, that's fair. The word is the same word for seed in Genesis 3. What the text is tracking on is that the seed of Adam and Eve that would come and crush the serpent's head and bring about the destruction of evil in the world that was introduced through the serpent and through our rebellious alignment with the serpent is going to now come through Abram, his seed. The Hebrew word is zerah. It's not the only place that appears in the prologue. Noah's seed is supposed to spread out and fill the earth. But Genesis is doing what it's been doing. It takes a single person, then it spreads it out, it talks about a lot of people, and then it narrows its focus again on a single person. So all of the people from Noah down through Babel, and then all the line of Shem through Peleg, now down to Abram. Abram's bloodline will now be the seed. And we talked already about this. I will make your name great. These connections back here, reflecting back to Babel, where humanity wanted to make a great name for themselves, which itself was reflecting back on Genesis 6:4, those callbacks over and over again. The further you go through these stories, the more callbacks you should pick up on. One of the best ways to do that is to read the Bible in different translations. Because, like the NLT using the word descendants, offspring in the NIV, seed in some of the more literal translations of Genesis 3:15, it's all the same Hebrew word. So this stuff gets lost in translation. The best thing that you're going to be able to do without actually studying a little bit of Hebrew here is to read it in different translations and get used to the fact that these words are all translating the same Hebrew word. A great name is all translating stuff that takes us back to the Nephilim, men of the name. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. The God who scattered the people at Babel in judgment for their continued rebellion against his own kingly rule over the world and his will for the world, God still loves them and God is still interested in them. So this is his work to reclaim them. God wants the people he divided and divorced at Babel back as his own people and his own possession. But to do that, he's going to build a nation, create a nation, and then have that nation reach out to all the other nations. He is still interested in humanity, but God's not going to change the rules that he established at creation just because humanity has rebelled. The rules were God is going to do what he's going to do in the world through humans. Whatever he's going to do, he's going to pick human partners to do it through. Good or bad. Judgment can come through human partners. Blessings can come through human partners. So when God is going to deal with human rebellion, he's going to partner with humanity, which means it's going to be a slow process. And interestingly enough, Abraham actually follows God's call faithfully. Verse 4, Abraham went as Yahweh commanded him. Again, keep in mind, he doesn't actually know where he's going. When he's going and he sets out, he doesn't know where God's going to end up leading him. That's the kind of faith that Abram has. And that's a part of the faith that you and I must have and exercise. Verse 5, Abraham is not alone. His wife, his nephew Lot, the entire semi-nomadic tribe go with him. They follow his leadership. Now, if you remember last week, I argued that Abram's father Terah is still alive when Abram sets out for Haran. Abram gets the call in Ur, but the whole family, including his living brother and his living father, go with him down to Haran. But Abram leaves and keeps going past them, but his brother and his father settle in Haran. Abraham still doesn't know where he's going until he gets there. Verses 6 and 7. He gets to Shechem. Say Shechem. Shechem. It's a Hebrew guttural. Shechem. 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 Well, and while he's in Shechem, and I'll show you a map here in a little while of where Shechem's located, Yahweh appears to him and he says to your offspring, to your seed, descendants, I'm going to give the land, this land, the land of the Canaanites. Why is that an interesting promise? Remember Abram's circumstance here. His wife goes with him. But what's the deal with him and his wife? Very good, Casey. They don't have kids and they can't have a baby. They're really old, which is part of it. Right? Sarah's old enough that her childbearing days are behind her. In case any of you teenage boys didn't know, women can only have babies from a certain time in their lifespan, right? From a teenager when they hit puberty until they're old enough that they hit menopause, which, roughly comes in their 50s. Abraham and Sarah are already beyond that age. They can't have a baby. They never did. She is barren, which makes them absolutely perfect in Yahweh's mind. Because when she has a baby, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that the baby came as a supernatural blessing from Yahweh. This is part of it. And this is the faith of Abraham. A God is appearing to him and saying, you who are 75 years old and have never had kids, I'm going to give you kids. And those kids are going to be the blessings of the whole world. And in fact, those kids are going to receive the land of Canaan. But the Canaanites are still in the land. Shechem is in a central location. It's right at the heart of the land, a land ruled by pagans and their pagan gods, where Yahweh, through his human agent, invades the land. He makes a declaration of war. When a God says, I'm going to give this inhabited land to you and your people, that's a declaration of war against the other gods. And by extension, the other gods that serve the people. They're the other people that serve those gods. That's the right way to say it. This is what Yahweh is declaring in this verse. In verse 7, when he says, I'm going to give this land to you, he says, I'm going to kick these gods out, I'm going to kick their people out, and you and your descendants are going to have it. And then through Abraham, Yahweh receives worship from his new people. So redemption of dark places is already beginning in micro form here with Abram and his life. Okay? Abraham's movement from central Canaan to southern Canaan. He's traveling from Shechem. He goes down a little bit further south to the Bethel Ai area. Bethel's on the west, Ai's on the east. They're kind of right next to each other, tilted a little bit, but it's like a region. And then he travels south towards the Negev, and he's going from place to place, and he's setting up altars to Yahweh throughout the land of the Canaanites. That's spiritual warfare. That's what it is, according to the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, where illicit pagan gods reign and rule, where God's faithful people invade their territory and worship him. God is invading those spaces. And what Abraham does, that should be what Abraham does is repeated, not is not repeated. So take that word not out of that sentence. What Abraham does is repeated throughout Israel's history. So let's look at a map here. This map I just Googled and got it, and it was the best one. So they're putting down here in the traditional site. I would argue that is much probably up here. But he's coming down to Haran, which is up here in the north, and he's coming all the way down here, and you see Shechem. Shechem is the first place that he stops, where Yahweh appears to him, and he says, this strip of land, it's only about like 90 miles from north to south. It's not a very big strip of land. It's only about 30-ish miles wide from the sea to the Jordan right here. He's going to get some of the land over here eventually as well. But the main promise here is this strip of land here, stopping in Shechem, which is further north, but it's in the land. He says, you're going to get all this land here. Then he travels to Bethel here, Ai, kind of down south, so he's a little bit further in the south. And then you see the Negev desert, the southern desert. That's all that means. It's the Hebrew word for south. So the desert down here. So he's traveling down south. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that he went all the way to the desert. Maybe it does, but that's kind of irrelevant. He's just moving south. They're just tracking geographically what he's doing, north to south. He's invading the land, building altars, and worshiping Yahweh everywhere he goes. That's spiritual warfare. The way that we use the term, this is what you need to understand Abram doing with the Canaanites in the land. What do you remember about Canaan from the prologue? He comes up. Whose son is Canaan? I'll give you a hint. So Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The one named after pork.
Wasn't there?
Ham, yes. Do you remember what I argued Ham did? How Canaan's birth came about?
Oh, wasn't it trying to take control of the family? So
Exactly. So what did he do to try to take control of the family?
he raped his mother.
He raped his mother.
Oh.
And out of that rape came Canaan. And when Noah gets drunk, and while he's drunk, Ham, sensing his father's weakness, tried to establish his rights over the family. He doesn't have any rights over the family. He's probably the youngest son, which means if he doesn't fight for power, he's not going to get any. He's not going to be the next patriarch. So when his father gets drunk one night, and his father's too drunk to stop him, he goes in and he rapes his mother, gets her pregnant, and that child is Canaan, which is why when Noah wakes up, he doesn't curse Ham. He says, cursed be Canaan. That idea of waking up. When his father realized what happened, realized what Canaan's, circumstances of Canaan's birth was. That's the idea when he woke up. It doesn't mean he woke up the next day sober again. It's idioms. You're going to have to learn to read Hebrew idioms and pick up on them if you're going to read the text correctly. So Canaan is an incestuous birth from a son and his mother, of a son trying to usurp power. Make his own name great was another way that you could say that. Extend his own power. And so Noah, as patriarch of the family, says he will not be the greatest, he will be the least. And that's the land that those descendants are living in. And Abram, who we saw last week is a descendant of Shem, Ham's brother, is going to be blessed because Shem was blessed as the leader of the family. Even though Japheth is the oldest son, it's the second-born son, Shem, that will constantly be blessed in Genesis. Abraham is not even the firstborn son, in all likelihood. We don't know that for sure, but he gets the firstborn blessings because he leaves. Anyway, I don't need to go into that. So Canaan is Ham's attempt to be the greatest in the new world. And God says, in response, you will be the least. Shem will be the greatest in the new world. But Japheth's the oldest son, so how come he doesn't get it? Don't know. And out of Shem, who will be the greatest, comes Abraham, in who all the blessings of the nations will come. The same things of the prologue are playing out here. God knows what he's doing when he says, I'm going to give this land to these people who try to lift themselves up and be greatest by their own power and might. The same thing that the Nephilim do. The same thing that Ham did. Canaanites do. And it says, I'm going to lift up and exalt the people who will just trust me and let me do it for them. They're not going to force their own way. They're not going to force their own power and control. I'll preach about this later because this is exactly what the king of Israel is not supposed to do in building up his own military. It's the same basic thing, a different way. The people that God will exalt are the people that will trust God and let him do it. Not force and control circumstances so that they get their way all the time. It's exactly what Jesus did. He trusted God even to the point of death on a cross. And he let God exalt him to the name above all names, so that at the name of Christ, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. He's the authority of all authorities, equal with God. He now possesses all authority in heaven and earth because he trusted God even to the point of death. Abraham is trusting God to the point of leaving behind everything that would constitute a blessing in his mind. And he's trusting God and he's invading dark places. He's carrying on the prologue story, and where the prologue is already set up, blessings will come from against the curses of Canaan. Abram's direction here and these specific locations on the map are actually repeated by his grandson Jacob. Jacob, in Genesis 34 and 35, what Jacob actually does, let me back up here. Jacob has to flee the land because he pissed off his brother, and his brother wants to kill him. We'll get to that. And so what he does is he goes back up and he lives for 14 years in Haran. Jacob goes and lives up there, but when he comes back 14 years later, he follows the exact same trajectory, the exact same sites here in Genesis 34 and 35. He goes to Shechem, he goes to Bethel and Ai, and then he moves south again. But he's not the only one, all right? So that's what I just said. And what you're supposed to pick up on is that the Acts of the Fathers, Abram, prefigured the journey of the offspring. Later in time, the journey of the offspring, the seed, are going to replicate Abram's story here. And then when Joshua and the Israelites begin the conquest, guess where they start? If you actually read chapter 5 all the way through chapter 10 of Joshua, which we're not going to do for the sake of time, they start right around Shechem with Jericho in that same area. Then, after conquering Shechem, they move a little bit south to the Bethel Ai area. They start conquering there, and then they do the southern campaign, and they conquer south in Canaan. Then, after they've conquered south, they move back up north, and they start conquering north of Shechem. So the first campaign of the conquest is in the south. But Abram sets the stage. Jacob follows the same pattern, and then later, all the offspring of Israel. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. All the offspring of Abram follow the same pattern. History is repeating itself, not only in the book of Genesis, but throughout the Old Testament. That's actually something of a theological point that is constantly being made if you don't skip geography. The authors of the Bible don't come out and tell you, hey, Abraham did this, this, and this. And then when Jacob does it, he doesn't say, now remember, I told you Abraham did that. You wink, wink, you get what I'm saying. He doesn't come back and say anything. He records Jacob's journey as repeating Abraham so that you as a good reader can pick up on it. But you're going to actually have to be a good enough reader to pick up on it because they're not going to come back and tell you in the book of Joshua. They're not going to come back and tell you 30 chapters from now, 25-ish chapters from now, when you get to Genesis, that Jacob is repeating Abraham's trajectory. They would pick up on that. You need to pay more attention and learn to pick up on these things because the story that God is trying to tell and his work throughout history repeating itself is captivated by these stories saying he stopped here, then there, then here. 2 generations later. He went here and there and there. Oh, look at that. It's the same. 400 years later. Oh, yep, they went here, they went there, and then they went there. Oh, look, it's exactly the same. And the point is, over all this stuff, that Abraham's conquest of the gods prefigures the later conquest of Joshua and all of Israel over the gods of Canaan. Abraham's movement should be viewed as a mini conquest over the gods, and therefore over evil powers. The Lord, who cared for Abram, continued to care for Jacob, and he continued to care for Israel during the time of Joshua. Don't you think that that God, who is faithful through all of these generations and all of these works, will be faithful to you if you step out in faith and follow him? That's the point. If you can pick up on that theology and see that picture in your head, you will see the same things repeated over and over again, 1,000 times in the Bible. But sometimes they're so subtle, geographically relevant, that if you skip the geography, you won't pick up on it. It's Seth's line that began in Genesis 4:26 that began to call on the name of Yahweh, right? This is another callback to the prologue. 4:26. Seth is born as a replacement for Abel because Cain killed him. And that's kind of what his mom says. The Lord has given me another son in the place of Abel because Cain killed him. That son is Seth, and it's in Seth's lifetime. Probably implied in that passage that it's through Seth's influence that people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. So we work backwards from Genesis 12, and you're paying attention to the genealogies in chapter 5. This is the last verse of chapter 4, and then we immediately get a bloodline of Abraham down through Seth to Noah. So if you just work backwards in thought, Abraham is a descendant of Shem, the son of Noah. Noah's a descendant of Seth, the son of Adam. So Genesis has already given us the seed from Adam, where the promises is made, down through Seth to Noah, through Shem, down past Babel into Abram. And Abram is following his descendant Seth's idea that he calls upon the name of Yahweh. So this hope and this invasion against evil and dark powers is constantly being brought up in Genesis. All of the gods that they thought of as the stars. If all of these gods had turned away from Yahweh, because they think of stars as gods, celestial powers, right? This is their mindset. We've been over this. All of these gods are nothing compared to the one Yahweh, who created the gods and is king of the gods. Let them all rebel. God has preserved the bloodline and the seed for centuries already. And he's continued to actually preserve that bloodline straight down to today. We're sitting here in this room talking about it because God did this 4,000 years ago. The seed has been preserved from the beginning. It is the work that God is starting to take form in and through Abraham. And as we go on through the rest of the patriarchs, he will continue it down through the bloodline of Abraham. But only specific bloodlines are going to get in on this promise. As God builds many nations from Abram, only one of them will be the seed.